They left them on the shoulder of a country road, as if they were nothing more than old luggage to be discarded. The 3 cars pulled off, engines idling for a moment like indifferent beetles, then roared back onto the highway. A handful of dust rose, swallowed the little heap of canvas suitcases, and a voice, sharper than the sun, cut the heat. "Survive without me." Antonio sat frozen on the cracked tarmac, the word lodged in him like a splinter. Rosa stood beside him, one hand still on the strap of a worn satchel where she kept the small treasures of a life lived simply, a photograph in a faded envelope, a shopping list folded many times, a soggy handkerchief with the smell of the first house they'd bought together. The wind tugged at her hair. Their children's taillights blinked away and then were gone. It should have been a single small insult. 3 cars, 3 backs, a final slam of doors. Instead, it landed like a verdict. People can survive being poor, Antonio thought. They had. They could survive hunger, toil, illness. But there is a cruelty worse than need. The deliberate erasure of a shared history. To be told in a moment that the life you build for others meant nothing. He could still feel the weight of the years in his hands. Calluses laid down like a map of labor, the raised scars where a nail had once caught his palm in a storm. Veins like small rivers, a skin that had been sun and soil and oil. His hands remembered the field they had sold, more vividly than the mind did. The field where Olivia had first learned to ride, where they celebrated small things, where one generation planted for another. He remembered the night they had walked into a shabby lawyer's office and traded soil for tuition, when 2 of their children demanded education they themselves could not afford. They had said yes, because their names were written in the margins of a future they trusted to their children. "Sit down, love," Rosa said, though her voice trembled. She guided him to a low stone curb. They shared a bottle of water split between trembling fingers. The bottle was nearly empty. The sun pressed on the road like a judgment. Dust clung to the hems of their trousers. Around them, the world kept going. A truck thumbed its way past. A dog barked in the distance, as if nothing had happened. Antonio tried to pin meaning to the moment, to fold it into something that made sense. The last years had been a series of small betrayals, the postponements of phone calls, the excuses about money, the late-night messages that always ended with promises. Yet this was not an accident of neglect. This was precise. The way the seatbelt had tightened around Rosa when she tried to climb back into the car, and Marcelo had snapped the door. The way Bruno had driven on with a look that could be read as impatience or triumph. Patricia's face had been a map of conflict. She had opened and closed her mouth and opened it again. But in the end, the word never came.
"You can't mean it," Rosa whispered. She had been a small, quick woman once, hands fast at the sewing machine, until her fingers had lost her nimbleness. Now she folded the fingers of her remaining hand into the sleeve of her cardigan and inhaled the dust like a strange perfume. Tears glittered but did not fall. Sometimes she smiled, in the way exhausted women smile at calamity, because the muscles have learned the motion. They did not shout. There's a dignity in silence when the world conspires to strip it away. Antonio pressed his forehead against the shaft of his arm and listened to the echo of the last thing his youngest had said as he climbed back into the car. We can't be responsible forever. Responsible. The word tasted like ash. A couple of hours later, when the sun had started to lean toward afternoon and their mouths were dry, a truck hummed up the road. It slowed, the engine let out a low, considerate sigh, and a man in a grubby cap climbed down with the fluid gait of someone who had spent a lifetime in cabins and open palms. "Are you two okay?" he asked without preface. His name was Josue.
He had the face of someone who had seen too many roadside things and made a habit of doing small mercies. He shaded his eyes with a hand darkened by diesel and held a thermos like a peace offering. He listened to their story without astonishment, perhaps because in his line of work he'd listened to the bluntest truths of the road. He offered them water, then a place to sit in his truck under a shadow of borrowed tarp. He did not ask guilt-laden questions, nor offer pious comfort. He said simple things. You can come with me. There's a boarding house in town. Lourdes looks after folks. She'll find you bread and a bed. Lourdes's pension was a place as warm as a hearth, even in midsummer. It smelled of stew and lemon-scented soap. It had at the back a row of small rooms tiled with age and care. Lourdes herself was a woman with shoulders like a hymn, broad, lovingly stoic, a keeper of keys and of stories people left behind. She ran the place like someone who understood the economy of compassion. A meal here, a warm blanket there, and always, at the center of it, a cup of tea and empty chairs for neighbors. They arrived at Lourdes as strangers in the eyes of the town. In the eyes of the pension, they were not strangers at all. Lourdes had a way of asking one question, "Who's hungry?" and then forgetting the rest of the world until he had eaten. She did not ask about their children, about why they had been abandoned. She set plates down and listened, and when she learned the gist, she hummed an old song under her breath and pressed another slice of bread into Rosa's hand. "There's shame in needing," she said, "but survival is not shameful." That night, in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and of other people's lives, they lay awake and assembled memories.
The house they had made, the small garden they had tended, the sound of their children learning to walk, all like brittle ornaments they now held in trembling palms. The pension's thin curtains shivered. Outside, a dog lifted its head and accepted a world that went on. Antonio took from his satchel a leather folder he had always brought when they left home. It felt heavier tonight than the weight of his arms. He had kept it tucked under a mattress for years, because some things are not for the light. When he unbuttoned the flap, the smell of old paper rose up like the smell of a place you left as a child. There were receipts, a brittle map, sheets of paper with names and numbers, and a small faded deed stamped with a name from the previous century. On top, in a careful hand, a letter from his father explained pieces of land held across generations. There were other proofs, a map with a boundary outlined in pencil, a note that a neighbor had once promised half the yield of his harvest should the need arise. Rosa pressed her thumb to the corners of those pages like a woman seeking a blessing. "We thought we had given everything," she said. "We gave them the best we could." Antonio closed his eyes and remembered the day they sold part of the property. They had argued then, with the kind of fierce rightness that comes from wanting more for a child than the terrain of a town will allow. Marcelo, impatient and clean in his shirt then, had pleaded, and they had traded a sliver of earth for what seemed a promise, a scholarship, a future. The math of love had never seemed precise until now. Now every choice felt like a ledger with entries that did not balance. The next afternoon, Dr. Renato walked into Lourdes' small office with the patient surety of a man who had looked at worse and chosen to help anyway. He was not an extraordinary man. He wore glasses that sat low on his nose and a suit that had seen rain. His job in the town was to be the practical hand that translated the law into human decisions. He had helped dozens of neighbors arrange papers, confirm births, prevent petty squabbles from hardening into grudges. Antonio and Rosa sat across from him at a table scarred by years of ledger books and the smudges of coffee. Antonio laid the folder on the table as if the papers were fragile things rather than the cornerstones of a new turn. Renato opened the deed carefully. He ran a finger along faded ink. "This could, and I say could because I won't promise what I cannot promise, be worth a great deal," he said. His voice was careful. He did not want to light a match in a dry place. "There are developments on the edge of the town, a new corridor of expansion. If this is indeed contiguous with that tract, there might be interest from private buyers or companies. It was the kind of news that makes the air feel electric and suffocating at once." Hope arrived on a thin thread. Imagine a house paid for. Imagine a quiet life away from handouts. Imagine dignity restored in tidy bills and the ability to sleep without worry. But Dr. Renato's tone prevented their minds from running wildly. "I'll need to verify records," he said. "We'll need to go to the registry, confirm chain of ownership, check for any encumbrances. It's a process." Antonio heard the word process as one hears thunder in the distance, inevitable and long. He also understood the other thing the lawyer did not say. If the land had value, people would move. The world has a habit of sniffing out anything that glints. News in small towns was a scent that lifted and traveled. It lifted faster than they expected. Before they could tidy the hope into a practical plan, a man in a pressed shirt and a soft leather briefcase arrived asking directions to the property. His name was Claudio, and he had the precise manner of a man whose life depended on deals. He was a contractor's representative, he said. He measured things not with tape, but with ambition. He asked questions with the intimacy of someone who already knew the contours of a bargain. "You're the family?" he asked, not unkindly, when he caught sight of Antonio's hands. He had an eagerness that was almost technical. His voice smoothed the edges of avarice. "We're looking at parcels in this region. The state has signaled interest in a new development corridor. If you have clear title, well, you understand. There's a lot of money in transforming land." Antonio closed his hand around the folder as if it were a child. He measured the man with the careful mistrust of someone who has watched fine words become chains. He did not yet know the patterns of how interest becomes pressure. He did not yet know how a town can be reshaped in the span of a single conversation. He only knew that the man's shoes spoke of the cities, and the man's watch glinted with a time that ticked faster than the slow rhythm of his life. The arrival of Claudio set things in motion. The rumor, because in towns questions quickly become rumors, ran ahead of the facts. By the next day, Juan from the bakery had heard that there was a parcel of note. By evening, someone else had muttered that the sons might return with lawyers of their own. The town gathered news like bread gatherers gather crumbs, some of it true, some of it ornament. When Marcelo learned that there might be value in a plot his parents had never told him about, something old shifted inside him. He had lived by a different scale of life. A downtown office, late meetings, the intermittent satisfaction of a bonus arriving at the end of a quarter. Yet beneath his tailored shirts and confident gait lay an insecurity that had never been cured by promotion. He had always wanted to be more than the sum of his parents' provisions.
He believed, with the stubbornness of someone accustomed to making plans, that money could fix relationships as surely as it fixed a building's facade. If his parents had a piece of land with value, then it was a thing that could be drawn towards his geometry of life. Bruno reacted with something colder, a calculation that looked like survival rather than malice. Patricia, who had been fragile when they left, now felt the stirrings of possibility wound tight with fear. If the land could be sold, perhaps this could stitch back what had frayed. They all had their rationalizations. Love, after all, often masks itself as a demand for recompense. Yet the memory of the road was still fresh. Rosa could see, with the clarity of someone who has been stripped, the readiness in their children's eyes, now that a different future glimmered. Requesting presence after absence was not reconciliation. Antonio understood this, in the way he understood the seasons. There are times to plant and times to harvest, and not every season is an invitation to sow again where you once reaped greed. After talk of property value began to trumpet through the town, some people came to Lullard's pension with halves of advice and hints of interest. A neighbor approached with an offer to help register the paper at the city office. Others arrived with the soft concern of those who fear a family falling into public spectacle. For the pension's guests, it was an unwelcome storm. They had fled gossip and not the reality of the world's appetite. At night, when the pension street lamp cast a yellow pool over the courtyard and the distant owl declared its watch, Antonio sat with the folder across his knees. Rosa would sometimes wake in the small hours and sit with him, hands entwined like vines, and they would not bother to name the emotion, because naming it would make it sharp. The folder was a hinge now between two futures, one where their children might reappear repentant or covetous, another where they could create an existence built on a new architecture of justice. "Maybe we should have told them sooner," Rosa said once, the words felling like someone undoing stitches. "It was never ours to give," Antonio answered, and his voice was low. "We kept it. It belonged to the family. But you know how sons' minds work. They assume the world owes them." "What will you do if they come asking?" she asked. The question was not purely about money. It was about the wider ledger: forgiveness, boundaries, pride, and the fate of a life's dignity. He thought of the nights they had sat at the kitchen table and balanced meager budgets against their children's education, of the conversations with teachers about fees, and the hours Rosa had stitched into uniforms. He remembered one July when the roof leaked, and he had sold a corner of land so that one child could travel to the city for an interview that led nowhere.
The ledger of love, he felt, could not be reconciled with the ledger of greed.
"You know me," he said finally. "I won't be cruel, but I won't let them treat us like something thrown away either. The land will have to be used for shelter, for care, for the town that helped us breathe when they deserted us." The words made a map in Rosa's chest. Justice as shelter. She had been on the receiving end of charity more often than she had given it out. She knew how it healed small places where pain had gathered. The idea of turning a private inheritance into a public act felt like a restoring salve. In the days that followed, the town's attention turned outward and inward at once. Dr. Renato, methodical and careful, began the slow work of verification. He walked the paper to the registry, peered at maps, asked old men who kept the neighborhood's histories in their heads. He did not make promises, he made outlines. If the title is clear and if the chain of ownership is intact, then you have options, he told them. He mentioned buyers and interest, but he also mentioned community trusts and the idea of giving back. He used the word stewardship, which is a civic code more reliable than sentiment. And as scheduled human stories often do, life began to ricochet toward confrontation. It started small, a neighbor passing by with an awkward look, a cousin asking if they planned to move back to their old house, a cousin's cousin who remembered that his cousin's developer friend had once mentioned this corridor. Each new voice applied pressure like water on a crack. The town circulated suggestions: sell to the highest bidder, partition it among the brood, establish a fund. People took sides without wanting to commit to solitude. Some thought the parents owed nothing to those who had hurt them. Others argued that blood was a stronger law than pain, that forgiveness demanded a return. One evening, the sky heavy with a storm that had not yet fallen, Antonio woke to the sound of raised voices outside Lourdes' door. He slipped into the corridor and peered around the curtain. The town had become a theater of motives, whispers of entitlement, murmurs of guilt. He recognized the cadence of his son's voices without seeing them. Marcelo's tone was urgent, precise. Bruno's was impatient. Patricia's came through as a small, wavering thing, pleading for understanding. They were pleading for something they had thrown away days ago. Antonio let the curtain fall and went back to the bed. He felt a steadying resolve for the first time in a long while. Perhaps life had given him one final chance at shaping the aftermath of his choices. The thought felt like a gift and a burden at once. He had never been a man to seek revenge. He had always wanted fairness. But there is a difference between fairness and the reckless attempt to fix all wrongs with a single act. He thought of the pension's worn chairs and Lourdes' steady hands and the lonely people who sought refuge under her roof. There were so many small hurts that a piece of land could heal if used rightly. He lay awake and formulated a plan that was less a legal strategy than a moral architecture. He would not be driven by the spectacle of his son's return. He would consult, he would verify, and above all, he would decide in a way that preserved dignity for himself and for Rosa. He was no judge, but he could be a steward. Outside, the rain began at last, and it washed the dust from the road into lines and streams like faint correction marks. It hit the pension's roof as if rehearsing a long-expected cleanup. Inside, the small lamp beside Antonio's bed hummed, and the pages of the deed in his mind became a map of a different purpose. When dawn unfurled its pale fingers over the town, someone knocked at Lourdes' door with a hurried rhythm. A voice spoke, breathless and clipped. "I need to speak with them. I have documents, and I have a proposal. I came with counsel." There was a pause, then the rustle of a man stepping back. Antonio stood from his chair and smoothed his shirt the way men smooth their armor. Rosa came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke the word confrontation. They had not yet named it. They did not need to. It was already taking shape on the threshold. Before the door opened fully, a woman from the pension, a neighbor with a coffee-stained apron and eyes that had learned to be kind, slipped a hand into Rosa's, squeezing. "No matter what," she said softly, "you will do what is right." Inside, the folder lay on the table like a sleeping thing. On the folder's top page, in handwriting Antonio had once admired for its neatness, there was a small note: "For the day you need to remember what is right." He had not known then what occasion would call for it. Now he understood. The note was not a liturgy of revenge. It was a compass. Across town, the three children stood outside a cafe waiting for their chance. They were dressed to be taken seriously. Marcelo checked his watch for the 5th time and rubbed at a restless thumb. He had rehearsed words under his breath, apologies and excuses and pleas for understanding, while secretly calculating sums and scenarios. He could admit, privately, that he had been ashamed of calling his parents when he could not promise the help they had wanted.
He could also admit he had been afraid that poverty might rub off on his careful life like a stain. Now, opportunity knocked in a new form, a line in a legal registry that might equal money, stability, and a return to respectability. Bruno paced and grew impatient. "We can't let them give it away," he muttered. "Do you understand? If they donate this to a pension, what's left for us?" His voice was raw with the logic of need. Patricia put both palms to her forehead and inhaled sharply. "We were wrong to leave them," she said, and the sentence was a crack of daylight. Not full confession, but enough to soften the shape of her conscience.
She looked at the two men, and then at the cafe window, where, through the glass, a reflection of the town's life passed by in small domestic scenes. A child with an ice cream, a couple arguing over a newspaper, an elderly man feeding pigeons. They were, each of them, a tangle. Pride, regret, hope, and calculation braided together until the strands were hard to separate. Theirs was a story of ordinary ruin, of choices made under pressure, of family loyalty frayed by the mistakes and urgencies of real lives. When finally they made their way to Lords's door, they found the gate already open. The conversation inside was small, measured. Antônio and Rosa did not stand up to theatrics. They received their children with the kind of steady view that had grown through years of honest work. Marcelo's apology, when it came, had the familiar shape of a practiced man trying on contrition. "Dad, we were wrong. Please, we can fix this. We can manage the process. We can handle buyers." He spoke fast, as if speed could collapse distance into reconciliation. Antonio looked at his son, at the man who had once been a boy with scraped knees and a fierce promise to the world, and he measured the truth of his voice. There was humility there, but also the hard set of someone who had planned before feeling. Bruno smoothed his tie. Patricia's voice trembled. They each carried the same old sense that love is owed, that forgiveness can be begged into being when the ledger is balanced in their favor. Antonio did not reply immediately. He placed a hand on the leather folder. Rosa's fingers rested on the table like talismans, patient, watchful. The silence came between them like a room they all had to cross. The sun shifted in it, uncomfortable. "You were gone," Rosa said finally, and the words were neither accusation nor entreaty, but an unvarnished statement. "You left us on the road when we needed you." Marcelo's hands curled into fists. "We had reasons," he said, and he named them. Stress at work, a mortgage looming, the brittle whip of society's expectations that pushes people to make choices they're ashamed of afterward. He spoke in the language of survival, because for him, survival had been a set of deadlines and credit scores. Rosa did not laugh. She listened to the reasons as though she were taking stock. There was a moment when anger flashed in her eyes, quick as a bird's wing, and then softened into something more steady. "How long will your reasons shelter you?" she asked, and the children flinched as if struck by a hand. This was the point where the story could go any direction, toward reconciliation wrapped in accountability, or toward a clash that would unspool what remained. Lords, who had watched enough human cycles to know the shape of these visits, moved between them like a midwife for broken conversations. She asked for coffee and sat down, because in many small towns, coffee is the instrument of truth.
Outside, the sky kept watch, inches of cloud gathering like an audience. Inside, the family's dynamics revealed themselves slowly. Marcelo's persistent explanation, Bruno's pragmatic impatience, Patricia's quiet contrition, and underneath, a shared fear of loss. Antonio's reply would be the fulcrum upon which the rest would pivot. He could open the folder and hand out property deeds like candy, or he could hold the papers tight and ask that those who returned do something that would prove the sincerity of their change. He thought of the pension's residents, Vera, the widow, who folded laundry as if folding the weight of the world, old Saint-Manuel, who shuffled his cards and told stories he had already told 10,000 times, but with the same enthusiasm as if they were brand new, the young mother who worked as a cleaner and dreamed of a small house of her own. Their needs were numerous and undramatic. Antonio thought of justice that was not a weapon but a tool. At the door, Claudio, the man with the briefcase, watched, an observer making notes. It was not possible to keep such a man outside of the human stakes. He had a business to run and a ledger to balance. He fit himself politely into the marginalia of the family crisis. "We can make this simple," he said,
as if simplifying were the same as healing. We can buy at the market price, speed up the process, make it clean. The offer had the sweet tang of grease for wheels, but Antonio felt a coldness in it, the preference of profit over people. He folded his hands. "I will not be hurried," he said, and his voice had the quiet authority of someone who had farmed the fields and felt the seasons speak back. "We will make decisions that restored dignity to those who need it the most." His words were not a sentence to his children. They were a gate. He would give them an option to prove themselves, a way to mend beyond words. Outside, the clouds broke, and a shaft of sunlight slid across the pension floor like a promise. The conversation moved into the afternoon with all the awkwardness of a family meeting whose agendas had become entangled. Love, money, guilt, practical need. Dr. Renata would follow up with the registry. Claudio would place a call. Marcelo and Bruno whispered strategies about buyers and partitioning, while Patricia wandered the edge of the room like someone who might step outside and refuse to return. The first act closed not with a resolution, but with a choice yet to be made. Antonio sealed the folder and placed it back in his satchel. "We will consider offers," he said carefully. "But first we will be sure, and we will be sure that vengeance is not our guide." His voice was not triumphal nor submissive. It was deliberate. The sons left with the murmured promise to return. Their steps hurried, as if by walking faster they could regain what inertia had cost them. Claudio returned to his car down the lane and dialed a number.
Renato took his leave with a nod, his mind already on paperwork and the humane cadence of law. Lourdes clapped her hands once and sent someone for soup. The town learned that a possibility had arrived, and the gossiping machine resumed its old rhythm. But within the small room, Rosa and Antonio looked at one another and felt the strange steadiness that comes after the first violent jolt of betrayal. They had been thrown into the world with a shove. Now they could choose their footing. That afternoon, as the sun started to slide toward the west, a courier arrived with an envelope stamped by a city office. The seal proved that some men had already acted on the rumor and logged entries into dusty books in distant desks. Antonio opened it with the deliberate care of a man unwrapping something sacred and started to read. The paper was not yet a verdict, but it was a question placed in their laps, a map that demanded a reply. He read the words slowly, tasting them. There was interest in the parcel. There were proposals. There was a promise that if the title were confirmed, developers might submit bids. If the town's leaders favored a different course, to maintain parcels for public use, there might be groups ready to support that too. It was not an ultimatum. It was the town holding a mirror to its own future. Rosa looked over his shoulder, and a small smile touched her lips. Not a smile of triumph, but one of resignation and cautious hope. "It is not ours to hold as a bargaining chip," she said. "If we had meant to buy back what we once sold, we would have held on to it. We had dreams for our children. But maybe the dream wasn't only theirs." They would not yet decide who inherited what. They would not yet sign papers. The world had placed interest upon interest, and decisions required currency both emotional and concrete. Inside them, the long arc of their life unfolded like a map with many roads. At the edge of one road was the possibility of justice that would shelter the weak. At the edge of another, the old dynamics tried to reclaim their place. When the day ended, the town hummed with 1,000 small reckonings. Marcelo and the others retired to their rooms to scheme and to pray, and in Marcelo's case, to smoke and stare at the ceiling, where the ceiling stared back. The pension settled in with its usual rituals of tea and cards, and the slow repair of broken people. The folder lay in Antonio's possession like a quiet storm. Across the square, someone started a rumor that would not be easily stopped, that a man who had deserted his parents might be left with nothing. In the rumor's wake, there was a thin sense of cosmic justice. But justice, in a small town, is rarely swift and never simple. It is messy and domestic, a matter of neighbors and the sound of doors opening and closing. For now, the town held its breath. The sons had returned asking for what they had abandoned. The world presented a ledger with many columns.
Antonio had the right to decide how his life's last yields would be distributed. He could leave the land to those who remained useful to his name, or he could refuse to let pain be repaid by further harm. Late that night, as thunder rolled like distant drums and the rain began to erase footprints from the street, Antonio lay awake with the leather folder against his chest. He turned the pages as if reading the lines might reveal not just parcels and scribbles, but the measure of a life. He thought of small hands and of a young bride's laugh many years ago. He thought of the look on Marcos's face when he had taken the keys and driven away. He thought of Rosa's quiet courage and how, in the face of being discarded, she had found a new tenderness for those who offered nothing but bread. The storm outside was a cleansing of the day's dust. Inside, decisions were forming like clouds ready to burst. He knew there would be more conversations, more demands, and a kind of moral arithmetic that would test the fabric of his family. He also knew, with the stubbornness of someone who had farmed and mended and loved, that he would not be hurried into injustice in the name of reconciliation. And at last he rose and went to the window. The road gleamed wet beneath the sodium light, and a single car was turning onto the main avenue, its headlights searching. For the first time since the day they'd been cast into the dust, Antonio felt the shape of an ending, not yet written, but within reach. A chance to turn a past of painful giving into a future of intentional care. He tightened his hand around the folder and felt as if for the first time the weight of possession that could be used for others. The next steps would need prudence and courage and the patience to make mercy practical. He did not know yet what the world would demand of his children or what they would be willing to admit. He did not know whether money would bring contrition or further hunger. He only knew that the road had given him a new question and that the answer would arrive not in an instant, but in a series of choices. Tonight, however, the town slept under the same stars. The pension's kettle clicked off. Lourdes put out fresh bread, and the folder on the table waited like a promise for a morning not yet come. Dawn came slow and steady, as if the town itself hesitated to wake to whatever verdict the day would bring. Antonio slept fitfully, the leather folder beneath his pillow like a small beating thing. Rosa rose before him and stood at the window, watching the morning clean the dust from the road with its pale light. She dried a cup and set it on the counter. Small domestic rituals held the world together when plans felt too large for their hands. By mid-morning, Dr. Renato returned with a measured face and a little notebook filled with names and dates. He had walked the registry's corridors, had spoken to an elderly clerk who remembered deeds by the smell of the ink, had made calls and asked for photocopies. He sat at the pension table and unfolded the fact of the land in practical sentences. "It's what it seems," he said. "The lineage on these papers is strong. There are no encumbrances that I can see from here. This parcel borders on a new corridor of development. Interest will follow." Antonio felt the word interest, like a breeze that could either bring rain or set tongues alight. He had expected this. He had not expected how quickly strangers would assemble around anything that hinted at value. Claudio reappeared within hours, the briefcase he owned a small prop for the way he shaped sentences that smelled of contracts. He spoke to Marcelo, Bruno, and Patricia in a language that translated every emotion into margin and price. He proposed a purchase. He proposed a fast closing. His eyes gleamed when he spoke of market value, the way some men pray. "You should consider an offer," he said politely to Antonio and Rosa when he knocked on the pension's polite door. "We can move quickly. There's interest from bigger players, even national groups. It could be a tidy arrangement if you wish to part with it." Antonio looked at Claudio as he would look at a man who had come to buy not only land but the quiet surrender of a town to a plan whose architects never smelled stew cooking in a pension's kitchen. "We will not be hurried," he replied. Claudio smiled as if that were not an obstacle but a theatrical inconvenience. Marcelo, listening with a grin that tried to be conciliatory, pressed close to the businessman as if proximity were strategy. He had rehearsed his words overnight, contrition braided with efficiency. He had already begun this slow arithmetic of what the land might mean to his portfolio, to his future. News, as news does in small places, flowed faster through backrooms and bakeries than through official channels. The town's opinion split in a dozen small ways. Some thought that blood demanded clemency no matter what. Others believed that those who abandoned their families had relinquished their claim to any bounty that might come. Conversations about fairness sat beside conversations about practicality.
the man who ran the hardware store, the school teacher who thought of classrooms that could grow, the widow who thought of warming a winter. Antonio and Rosa began to make lists, not ledger sheets for stockbrokers, but inventories of need. The pension's drafty back room, Vera's rent that was always a month late, the young mother who washed laundry until her hands bled, the neglected path behind the old chapel where children played in safety on Sundays. They thought of a small farm co-op a neighbor had dreamed about. They thought of an emergency fund for any person who might find themselves, as they had, without a door to knock on. What do you want?
Rosa asked him one evening, after a day of visits and questions, and that particular tiredness that wraps the shoulders like a shawl. She had been to the registry with Renato. She had annotated plans with the neatness that became her. To put the weight where it can sustain others, Antonio said. To be sure our names do not become a coin traded in the markets. We were given land to keep a family fed, not to be the engine of someone else's ambition. If money comes from it, it must buy dignity back for what we lost. That was the architecture of their decision, not vengeance, but stewardship. They would not give away their life's rest to the children who had left them on a road. They would instead use whatever value the land had to build shelter for the fragile, to support those who lived in the margins, and to secure a modest, respectable life for themselves, so they would not be a debt upon friends. Dr. Renato proposed steps that kept to the spirit of prudence. We set up documents that express your will, he said. We can establish trustees, an arrangement so that the land's sale, or its management, is carried out by a board that includes community members and the pension stewardship. We'll draft a testament that makes your intentions clear. Witnesses will sign. We will keep it straightforward so it cannot be easily undone. He spoke with the voice of someone who had learned the difference between legal technicality and moral consequence. It was not a romantic gesture. It required signatures, the presence of witnesses, money to pay for necessary filings. It required them to step into a bureaucracy they had avoided all their lives. They signed papers with hands that trembled for reasons both practical and symbolic. The leather folder, which had once held proof of land, now held contracts and a will drafted by a lawyer who asked nothing of them that would put them at risk. They chose trustees who were recognized in the town for nothing more than steady mercy. Lords, who kept keys to more doors than most people had houses. Dr. Renato, who had made law into a kind of neighborly service. A retired school principal who kept careful ledgers and a kind of equality of memory. They left instructions that the land's proceeds should finance a modest shelter in the town, fund health supplies for elders, and set aside a small sum to repair Lord's pension so that it could remain warm and welcoming. There was one part of the will that was as clean as it was final, the portion that named what would be reserved for their children. They left a token, a small sum to Marcelo, Bruno, and Patricia, enough to prevent later claims of cruelty, enough that no one could argue they had starved their heirs. But the substantial part, the value that might have fed a lifetime of comfort, was set to community stewardship. When Antonio read the will aloud that afternoon to those assembled in the pension, trustees, the sons, the pension's residents, the man from the bakery, his voice did what it had done his whole life. It carried the weight of hours worked, and hands that had mended things without ceremony. He began not with legalese, but with memory. He told, briefly, of the patch of field where they had watched their children chase a kite until dusk, of the night they had sold a strip of land so a child might go study in the city, of the mornings Rosa had risen while the house still slept to mend uniforms with a lamp and tea. He spoke with a kind of reverence that made these things sacred. Then he addressed the sons. "You told us," he said, and the room listened as if a verdict might be a single line. He did not shout. He had never been a man who shouted. "You told us to survive without me. You meant it, and we learned to survive. We learned also what dignity costs." There was a stinging in Marcelo's eyes, not just at the words, but at a grief he had never learned to carry. "Dad," he blurted, "we made mistakes. We can fix this. You're talking like we would take everything. We won't take the town from you." His voice carried the familiar strain of someone who believed that money could mend what distance had torn. Antonio set the leather folder on the table and opened the page that detailed his decisions. "I will not return to the history of making myself into a bank for any person who cannot respect the need for compassion," he said. "You had a chance to stay with us. You chose otherwise. I will not mistake your sudden tears for repentance. This is not a punishment. It is a lesson in stewardship." Patricia cried in a small, sudden sound. Bruno crossed his arms and looked out the window. Marcelo's face,
which had always been measured by the angles of his plans, unmade itself in the face of his father's calm. He tried to place a legal argument. There were ways to contest wills, he had read, but he had neither the patience nor yet the funds to execute them. He felt panic and a hot, irrational shame. "You can't do this," he managed. "We can negotiate. There's a way to make this better for everyone." The words were more industry than soul. They tried to find a seam where reconciliation and acquisition might meet. Lourdes poured coffee and did not look up. The trustees sat with hands folded. Antonio's response was simple and small. "We did not pledge this to wound you. We pledged it to the people who kept us under a roof when our children left us in the dust." Marcelo's chest worked as if he might speak. Then he walked out of the pension and into the town with the sound of his shoes swallowed by gossip. The sons left in different moods, a mixture of bitterness and calculation. There would be lawyers, they said. There would be claims of incapacity, of undue influence. Dr.
Renato met their questions with steady patience and the sort of refusal that boots could find on a sore-stomped path. The law could be used, but the will had been set with witnesses and proper filings. It would not be an easy thing to overturn. Outside, the town divided itself into small camps of sympathy and opinion. But what began that day, in practical terms, was the business of transformation. The trustees met again and drafted the framework for the shelter and the funds. They contacted local builders who owed the town favors. A carpenter offered materials at cost. Veronica at the bakery said she would host a series of fundraisers. Lourdes promised to train staff to run the shelter. The trustees did what they could with what they had. They turned an inheritance into a plan that looked like hands reaching out. For Marcelo, the day was the beginning of a different arc. He moved like a man who had seen his future rearranged and thought it a temporary inconvenience. He had a manager's instinct to push and to mobilize resources. He called old colleagues, he called investors. He hired counsel on credit, promising returns that were in truth hopes stitched together. He took loans at interest from lenders whose kindness expired nightly and whose patience cost more than money. At first, the town's judgment was a rumor heard in shop doorways. But business is a fragile thing. Clients are people who notice where a person's attention lies. Marcelo's distraction bled into his reports. Late nights at meetings about contests and contracts made him miss deliverables. A longtime client chose a different consultancy, citing concern about his partner's focus. Marcelo pressured harder. That pressure estranged him from colleagues who once would have covered his missteps with the kind of collegial gloss that only time builds. He took more credit, signed more risky deals, promised things he could not deliver. Vivienne watched and tried to steer him, as she had once steered his better habits. She was not indifferent to the drama of inheritance, but she had a child in her arms and mornings to tend that required practical provision beyond spectacle. She spoke to him gently, and once, in a kitchen where sunlight warmed a kettle, she said, "This is not what your father wanted. This is about dignity." He answered with numbers. He measured love in spreadsheets. He counted forgiveness in margins. Her face tightened like a string pulled to its limit. The first cracks appeared small. A missed mortgage payment because he had put funds into flimsy litigation, a late notice on an account because he had pledged it as collateral. He became the kind of man who measured his worth by a ledger that could be reversed with a single signature. Proud and private and reckless in public, he listened to advisors who fed his worst instincts, rapid action before the will was unassailable, pressure on the trustees, a campaign to sway public opinion.
The town, ironically, was a difficult place for such a campaign. Antônio and Rosa had shown themselves to be steady. They invited public discourse into their decisions. The trustees admitted the plan and the reasons behind it. The pension held a fundraiser. Veronica's pastries sold out. The carpenter and the retired school principal organized volunteers to clear a lot behind the chapel where the shelter might stand. For every voice that sided with Marcelo's urgency, two answered with the memory of the day the children had left their parents in the dust. Marcelo continued to burn cash on lawyers and PR. Bruno and Patricia did not go as far. Their lives were tangled in other necessities, and in different ways, they protected themselves with distance. Patricia, fragile with grief, spent nights walking the old neighborhood and found she could volunteer at Lord's pension on the quiet. She did not seek to undo the will. She sought only to touch the edges of a life she had harmed. Weeks later, when eviction papers came like a sound, Marcelo read them with the blankness of a man who had believed empire was a process immune to missteps. He and Vivian had argued until the words left their mouths used up and thin. Vivian, exhausted from trying to fix a man whose addiction to control had turned predatory, made a small suitcase and left with their child. She told him they could not continue to build a life on the shifting sand of litigation and damaged relationships. She begged for a return to simple measures: therapy, humility, work done well. Marcelo watched her go and felt the floor fall away. He had often believed that power would align love to his will. He had misread love as acquiescence. Now he found himself with fewer clients, mounting debts, a reputation frayed by a public the town had watched and judged. Lenders who had at first been eager became abrupt. The loans with burdensome interest became a trap. His pride, which once curved around his life like a protective shell, now made him difficult to help. He refused offers of small work, of practical projects that might rebuild him from the base up, rather than the height of sensation. He wanted the land, or rather the idea of the land as a symbol of rightness, restored to him. He would not accept help that felt like charity, for charity would admit failure. So he spiraled, calls missed, doors closed, and finally a legal fight that drained the last of his ready capital. The firm he had built declined and then folded, as firms do when leadership splinters. There are many ways to become homeless. For Marcel, it arrived in stages: a notice, a repossession, the slow surrender of keys to a house bought with borrowed dreams. Once the roof over his head was gone, his life moved outside the rhythms he had once taken for granted. He found himself in the downtown square at night, where the city lights make false suns, and where people who had nowhere else to go watched the world go by.
It was not an end painted with spectacle. There was no melodramatic fall. There was the smallness of humiliation and the rawness of exposure, the cold that reaches bone on a winter's bench, the hunger that mistakes memory for food, the loneliness replaced by the odd camaraderie of people who sleep under different stars. He was at once more and less than he had been. He encountered the edges of mercy now that he had spat on its face. Back in the town, the trustees moved forward with a practicality that made the plan visible. They sold the land, not at the highest price, but at a respectful one that ensured the funds were available to realize Antônio and Rosa's intentions. The shelter was a modest building that looked like every small town's attempt at a miracle. Simple rooms, a common kitchen, a small clinic where a volunteer nurse would check blood pressure and bandage hands. It stood behind the chapel like a quiet promise. Lourdes Overside's opening with the calm of someone who knows how to undo fear with bread and a listening ear. The fund established a small grant for elderly care, and a portion went to repairing Lourdes' pension so that her rooms were no longer drafty in winter. Vera's rent was paid for a year. The young mother who had wanted a house was given a small microloan to cobble savings for a down payment. The carpenter who had volunteered recruited 2 apprentices, giving work to those who might otherwise wander. Antônio and Rosa used a part of the sum to buy a modest home near the pension, a small house with a front porch where Rosa could hang lace and Antônio could grow tomatoes. It was simple, dignified, and importantly, paid for in whole. They did not use wealth to create spectacle. They did not erect statues or name roads after themselves. Their legacy was practical and quiet, a shelter that welcomed anyone who needed a bed for the night, a fund that paid emergency trips to the clinic, a community pantry, and a scholarship for 1 child from the town each year, a scholarship that taught not entitlement but responsibility. Time is an interesting negotiator. It does not erase consequence, but it softens edges and sometimes reveals shapes of regret. Marcelo, sleeping on a park bench and later under a friend's temporary roof, found himself face to face with what he had been before the suits and the deals, a son whose arrogance had eclipsed tenderness. He tried, haltingly and awkwardly, to ask for help from people he had once relied on for admiration and status. Many doors remained closed. He argued in public fora that the will was unjust and sought counsel that promised to topple a plan built with community witnesses and care. Those moves ate resources. In the end, they earned him little. Vivian, who had left with their child, returned months later not because Marcelo had demanded or deserved it, but because she felt a pull toward a grandfather and grandmother who had been mistreated.
She arrived with a child small enough to curl against a knee, and with the humility that comes from watching a life unspool. She did not approach with the swagger of a rescuer. She approached as a woman who had seen what disregard produces, and who wanted a different legacy for her child. Antônio and Rosa received her with a careful warmth. They had not cut out any limb that reached out in true repentance. They saw in her an ally, not a traitor. For Patricia, time led to small, honest work.
She spent mornings at Lord's pension folding bedsheets, learning the particular dignity of service. She began to attend church meetings again, not as penitent only, but as someone who wanted, in small ways, to rebuild trust. Bruno moved further from the conflict. He took work that required travel and quieted his tone. He did not publicly quarrel with his parents, so much as quietly resent the fate he had courted by his absence. On the bench one evening, by the shelter's newly planted trees, Marcelo sat with his head in his hands and watched a father and child pass by, laughing. He had been invited once to dine at the pension. He had declined because he could not sit in the same room where his life had been quietly judged. The shelter's opening day had been more than a ribbon cutting. It was a town revealing itself as its own keeper of values. Antonio had given a short speech and rose to the applause of those who had understood what the money must buy: care. Marcelo watched the laughter and felt the slow burn of regret. He walked to the shelter bench and sat a small distance away from where Antonio and Rosa were talking with a young volunteer. He did not at first meet their eyes. He felt a wild and childish thing, the desire to reclaim what he had lost by force. He had to fight it down again. Time is also the teacher of small mercies. One night, cold and exhausted, he sat outside the pension. A volunteer, someone who had once received bread from Lord's, took one look at him and, without questions, brought out a cup of soup and a blanket. The act had no strings, no press, no pity-made performance. It was simple, human, the kind of help that returns dignity in increments. Marcelo coughed and ate with the mechanical manners of someone who had been starved of such normal things for too long. He did not demand re-entry into the family's inner circle. He had no clean way to ask for what he had thrown away. If anything, the experience stripped him of any pretense that revenge could resurrect the dead parts of his life. He realized, slowly, the cost of replacing people with bargains. He might never reclaim that life. There is a difference between reparation and restitution. Antonio and Rosa had never wanted to be instruments of humiliation.
When, a year after the will's signing, Marcelo came to Lord's pension in the late afternoon with a small box of bread he had bought from Veronica's bakery, he came not with the bluster of a man who thought himself entitled, but with the quiet of someone who wanted a foothold in a new shape of relationship. He gave the bread to Rosa with an awkwardness that felt like an apology. Rosa accepted the bread and the apology with the softness she had always reserved for small things. She did not promise instant reconciliation, nor did she make an ultimatum. She said simply, "You can stay for supper if you like." It was an act that did not erase the past, but that opened a door, a narrow one, but practical. Marcelo sat at the pension table and ate among people who had taken turns in being lost and being found. It would be wrong to describe the end of this story as wholly redemptive. Marcelo's life did not snap back into place with the ease of a well-made garment. He found work of modest dignity, he reconciled in small ways with some colleagues, and he learned to live with less. He never reclaimed the house he had lost. There were nights when he walked the streets and slept under a sky he had once thought irrelevant. He had, in a sense, become homeless. The term did not denote only the absence of walls, but also the absence of the comfortable certainties he had once mistaken for worth. He learned slowly that being home is tethered as much to being trusted and loving as it is to bricks and mortar. In the town, the shelter stood and hummed. It did not solve every problem. No one building could. But it offered a threshold into dignity. People came with wet shoes and warmed their hands by a kettle. The trustees met yearly and accounted for funds with the same kind of steadiness Antonio had once used for planting seasons. The scholarship the couple endowed paid for one young person to study a trade each year. The pension's repairs were completed, and Lords retired a few months later in peace, handing keys to a younger woman who had learned to keep a door open. The story's delicate balance was in how it handled the children who had abandoned their parents. The plan Antonio and Rosa enacted was neither gallows nor sanctuary. It was rather a moral architecture. It refused to be weaponized by spite and refused the complicity of a world that rewards the loudest claims. The couple left a portion to the children, not because they loved money more than blood, but because they wanted to ensure that their decision could not be painted as cruelty.
They left the rest to a community whose members had shown them the steadiness of simple acts. Years later, when Antonio and Rosa sat on the porch of their small house and watched a grandson chase a bird into an early summer gust, they felt a flicker of contentment that had nothing to do with wealth. The shelter had become part of town rhythm. The pension hummed with volunteers.
Patricia taught sewing to women who came from out of town to learn. Bruno had a quieter business, but one that respected the value of work rather than the illusion of quick triumph. Marcello would pass by sometimes and sit at a corner table, a man remade by weather and quiet action. There were evenings when the past returned as a ghost to be saluted. Someone would say the words, "Survive without me," in a conversation with a friend as a warning or as memory. The line had become a cautionary talisman for the town, a simple sentence that meant too much. People used it as a story they told their children, not to make use of guilt, but to teach responsibility. In the end, the true legacy Antonio desired was not the redistribution of land alone. It was a small assertion about the dignity of life, that no person should be so disposable that their history could be thrown by a trunk at the side of the road. It was a belief in chosen family, that families are made not only by blood, but by those who show up when others leave. For Antonio and Rosa, the community they made with those who had offered them beds, bowls, and care had become family by choice. The son's consequences were not theatrically punitive, they were natural and worldly. Marcello lost the comforts he had once thought unassailable and learned with difficulty the practice of humility. Bruno's impatience cost him decades of trust he never quite rebuilt. Patricia found in service a way to stitch herself back to small honors. Viviani, who had always been the quiet center of practical tenderness, rebuilt her life in a way that included both town and family. She remained close to her grandparents, and in time, her child learned the lessons Antonio and Rosa had lived: work, dignity, and the right to set boundaries. Antonio and Rosa died in the small house that smelled of bread and basil when they were ready, not in dramatic beds with claims and counters, but in the ordinary course of a life spent well. The town gathered in mourning as it did for any who had given themselves to others. Their names became part of the town's quiet records. The shelter they had paid for did not bear their names on a plaque. Instead, a small notice in the library read, "In gratitude to those who taught us how to care." People remembered them in stories and in the practical work of the shelter, in meals served and in beds made. When the will was read at the end of the legalities, not as spectacle but as the closing of a book, the sons understood finally the depth of the lesson their parents had carved. The will had not been written in anger, it had been written in the language of making sure that love produces more than shelter for the privileged. Antonio and Rosa's choice was not instructing others to do the same in every circumstance. Rather, it was an insistence that dignity be protected when it is most at risk. The town, in the years that followed, kept a vigil for what dignity could look like.
It was less a sermon and more a series of small acts, neighbors checking on neighbors, a woman bringing soup for a man returning from a night on the bench, a child offered a scholarship to learn a trade. The shelter hummed with life and with quiet tasks, becoming the sort of place where people learned again how to hold one another. Marcello, who had once spoken the flinty words that set the story in motion, found himself on some nights returning to the bench by the chapel to watch the town carry on. There was in that watching a penitent patience. He learned to ask small favors, to accept a blanket without shame, to work in exchange for a bed. He learned that shame can be turned into growth if tended without the need to perform penance for an audience. There are many stories people tell to teach children how not to act, to warn them of greed, to instruct them in empathy, to remind them that the world keeps accounting even for those who think themselves above it. This story, with its dusty road, its leather folder, its pension that smelled of lemon soap, became one of those. It was not a parable of simple morality, where villains are easily labeled and goodness merely rewarded. It was a human story with complicated people who made choices and learned that consequence is often humbling. On an ordinary afternoon, a boy from the shelter ran up to Antonio and Rosa's porch and flung his arms around Rosa's knees. She laughed, the sound of someone who had learned to love without counting the cost. Antonio sat in a chair that had his shape and watched the town move in its small orbit of kindness. He felt the weight of the leather folder in a drawer, a thing of paper that had changed the coordinates of many lives.
He had used it as a tool to turn private wealth into public care. When a traveler once asked him why he had done it, he answered with a phrase that sounded like a small sermon, given more as fact than ideology. "When you are thrown to the road," he said simply, "you learn the value of who will come to your side." The traveler nodded, as one who had seen the world arrange its moral ledgers in many currencies. And so the town went on, patched and mended by choices that preferred repair to spectacle. The sons bore their scars in ways both quiet and public, lasting partly because of the consequences their actions had set in motion. The shelter stood as a testimony that inheritance can be turned into an instrument of communal care. The pension still smelled of lemon soap and bread. If there was one lasting line the town repeated, it was not "survive without me" as a boast or a threat, but as a cautionary note, to treat the people who gave you life with a dignity that cannot be bought back at the last minute. The title of the painful moment, the cold phrase said in a car as taillights blinked away, became the hinge on which a small community learned its values.
The intention of Antonio and Rosa had been less to punish their children than to create a future where dignity outlived indifference. At the end, when the town bent to the labor of memory and the couple's life was told in a dozen small ways, in the laughter of a volunteer, in a child learning a trade, in the repair of a pension's roof, the lesson landed not as divine retribution, but as the simple fact that choices have consequences. Marcelo, Bruno, and Patricia remained part of the town's fabric, forever altered. Some doors closed quietly, others reopened cautiously. Vivienne, who had chosen the child's steady life over the illusions of restitution, raised a son in a town that knew the story and taught its children the shape of true hospitality. And so, the will had left one man without the future he had assumed was his, and that outcome was not a triumph of cruelty, but of consequence. The town kept the story as a warning and as a comfort, that dignity can be protected, that community can be a family chosen by action, and that there is honor in making what you have become shelter for others rather than an instrument of your own vanity. If you have watched this unfold and felt its edges, remember this small practical thing. Generosity need not be grand to be real. You can volunteer at a shelter, give a warm meal, or simply be present for someone whose life seems to be sliding. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity matters. If you can, support a local shelter in your area. Sometimes a small act, like a bowl of soup or a warm blanket, is what keeps someone from being wholly lost.